Welcome to Role-Based Security. In this session, we'd like to talk about security in OutSystems, including how we can define the access control for our applications. To be able to do that, we need to be able to define different users and groups, and we also need to be able to define roles for our applications, and then be able to check the permissions and whether those users or groups might have these particular roles. So let's go ahead and get started looking at these topics. So if we start with security, OutSystems takes care of many low-level security matters. It has the ability to support HTTPS, which will encrypt the messages back and forth. It can do integrated authentication. Our generated code worries about things like code injection for screens and SQL queries. And then there's exception handling. So if we find some sort of security exception, we can go ahead and try to adapt to that. But in general, OutSystems can't determine the access control that you might want for your application. So we need to be able to define the elements that will decide who can get to what inside of our applications. So when we think about access control, it's just that. It's trying to determine and enforce who can do what. So the who is going to be the users or groups that we're going to allow to access different types of things, and the what will be which resources, what screens, what screen actions can they trigger. So there's a division between exactly who will do different things. And in general, for us to be able to determine who can do what they need to do, we need to have authentication. So authentication is the concept of identifying who is actually using an application. And then we want to validate who that user is. And we typically do this through some sort of check like a username and password. Sometimes you can do that via different types of certificates or other things. So there are a number of ways to validate user credentials, but most applications will use a username and password approach. And then once we know who you are, we need to know about your authorization, which is what you can do. So we may wish to check whether a user can do a specific task and validate if they have the permissions to do different things in that task. So how would we define some of these things? Well, to start with, defining who the end users are will be done inside of the user application. So this is a default application that OutSystems has automatically installed in the platform. And what it'll let us do is go in and decide who the users are. So we'll be able to create users, and in this particular case, we would need the username and the password for the different types of users and their actual name. So here you can see the user's application, and the user application allows us to create new users and search over existing users. So at any point, we would be able to create a new one of these users by just simply defining the basic information that we need. Now, users can also be created programmatically inside of our applications, and the way they're able to do that is the user application itself has a number of different actions that are defined on it, and two of them are user create and user create or update. So we can use those actions inside of our applications to go ahead and create users as well. Now, once a user is created, we want to handle the authorization as well. So we want to know which roles can that user be granted, or which roles will we grant a particular user, so we know exactly what they can do. So to be able to do that authorization, we need to define the roles first. So by default, OutSystems has two roles built in, one called anonymous and one called registered. So when you think about anonymous users, that's anyone who comes to our application, but we don't necessarily have to know who they are. The registered users will be any user that is registered in our user's application. So you can think of the user's application as a user registry, and the role registered would be any user that is in that registry. And then from there on, we can create application-specific roles. So here we have the OSMDB admin, which is our OutSystems Movie Database administrator, that role now has been created inside of our OSMDB module. Once that role gets created, 3 actions also get created. And those 3 actions are check for this role, grant this role, or revoke that role. So all of these actions would now be available for us inside of our application. And that means that at any given point, if we need to check what type of role the user might be in, we always have this check action to be able to do it. And if we wanted to grant or revoke the role that they might already have, we can do that as well. These roles can be shared among modules, so that if we define it in one module, we could also enforce it inside of another module. So this authorization can also be managed programmatically or inside of the user application. So here, if we look at one of our users in the user application, if we set up things to edit this user, we'd be able to edit the basic information. But at any given time, we can add this user to different groups, and then we can also assign this user different roles. So by assigning this user the role of OSMDB admin, now at any point in the application, we could check if they're in that role, and then allow them to do whatever they might need to do as an administrator. So checking the permission is using this action that we just talked about, but there is actually another way to check for permissions as well. If we think about the screens themselves can have a role property assigned to them. And that basically means that we're creating an authorization for certain people to use that screen. So here we see the movie detail screen. By default, the anonymous and register role are there. And then here we can see the OSMDB admin role is there. So by checking any of these roles, we're saying that those roles will have authorization to be able to see this screen. So at the screen level, we can say whether or not you would be able to see a screen completely. So some users could be left out and made sure that they're not able to see a screen. So if a user wasn't in one of these roles, they wouldn't be able to see it. By selecting registered, we're basically saying that any user in the user registry will be able to get to that role. But at any point inside of a screen, we may wish to go ahead and have a particular element or web block to be basically secured so that only a certain role can see it. So if some small part of the screen should only be seen by the administrator, then we might want to check by the role name. And in that case, we'd be using the action that we had created before, which is check the OSMDB admin role. So that check returns a Boolean condition. It's just going to come back and say yes or no, you are an admin or you aren't. So we could use that with an if widget. And by using it in the if widget, we could then hide that web block or part of the screen. We also can just actually go into certain widgets, and the widgets, some of the widgets have an enable or display capability. So we can decide whether it will be visible or not. So a couple different ways we can kind of allow users to see different types of functionality and different types of data that might be on the screen. Now, last but not least, sometimes we don't want to have to go in for every single user and assign them different types of authorization. So groups exist inside of OutSystems, and groups are simply groups of users. And just like a user, we can go into the user application for a group, and we can assign the group a role. And by assigning the group a role, then all the users inside that group will be assigned that role. And once the group is assigned that role, then we can still go ahead and check on a user basis whether or not they're inside that role. Now, groups can be created and managed not just in the user application, but again, there are actions inside of the user application, inside the user module, that will allow us to do this programmatically as well. So we can create brand new groups on the fly inside of our code, and then we could go ahead and assign different users to those groups as needed. So in this session, we talked about security and OutSystems, and we focused on the access control, which is really who can do what. And the who will be the different users and groups that might be in the user's application, And what they can do will be the roles we define. And once they're assigned to those roles, we can check permissions as to whether those users should be allowed to do certain types of things. So that's it for role-based security. Thanks for listening.